I strongly believe that remote work is increasingly the future. And I can speak to this a bit from why my company has been completely remote and why it's going to make so much more sense for lots of other types of businesses to follow suit in the not so distant future. Assuming you know what we're talking about, but just in case it's something that's maybe not been a part of your experiences, essentially, right, I don't have a physical office. My company doesn't have a building. My company doesn't have a space in a building, at least not uniquely. I'll talk about that more in a moment. But instead, I operate entirely online. When I travel, I still run my company. Everyone who works with it, as a contractor or otherwise, also deals with it entirely online. All of the customers are reached entirely online. There is not a central campus, etc. Now, the reason why this made sense for what I'm doing initially was, okay, so we've got like once a week meetings, and we used to be a local group before we were fully online. Even when we were a local group, I was paying a sizable weekly fee to rent a space for like an hour or two per week, so we'd have an ability to all meet together locally. Now, that meeting locally meant people had to go through traffic, they had to pay for parking, they had to basically account for practically double the time, partly because of Los Angeles traffic, partly from distances people were coming in from, to the point that when we started making it work for online people who were remote elsewhere, people in LA realized that it worked better for them too, to just not have to go to the physical thing, which helped lower my costs, which helped lower my overhead, which helped me lower my organization's dues, my membership dues, by like 25%. When I started, it was closer to 80. These days, it's closer to 60. It has been ever since we went fully online. And there's various reasons why companies, obviously certain kind of businesses, I'm sure will always need some sort of physical location. You want to go try on the shoe, try on the glasses, etc. Even in those, you're probably familiar with some of these increasingly emerging business models where instead of having to go to the store and try them on, well, you can actually look up online, have them send you several to try on, whether it's glasses for style, whether it's shoes to figure out which fit, send them back the ones you don't want. And that's not just abusing their return policy, it's increasingly enabled them to operate with much lower overhead from not having to open up a store on every single corner of every single mall just for people to find which shoes in their size are available. It's something which obviously Amazon has pioneered in terms of making sure that rather than every single bookstore in every single city needs a copy of every single book, just in case someone in that area wants it, thanks to massive online databases, centralized warehouses, shipping and distribution, and so on, whoever wants that rare book can find if it's available and can get it, because the internet and digital things, they're very good at search, very good at matchmaking, very good at certain kinds of tasks. Some of the reasons why companies have physical locations are for customers to be able to meet them or to be able to look important when they meet with other company representatives. Increasingly, that's where even virtual offices have been an answer. Virtual offices, again, some of you are going to be familiar with this, but if you're not, virtual offices are essentially, instead of every single business having to rent its own separate place to kind of park its business materials, its filing cabinets, its computers, where its employees would go to work. Increasingly, a virtual office, they've got several different kind of benefits they offer. The one which I'm referring to here is basically per-use meeting spaces. So, okay, I'm traveling and I'm in a big city and I need to be able to meet with someone important from a publisher or a journalist or someone who needs to seem respectable around and not just be in a coffee shop, which might be fine for a lot of people too. If I want to seem a little bit more fancy, have a conference room, etc. locally, well then I can rent that on a per hourly basis, per evening basis, etc. And that's increasingly been people's answer for when they need to do those kind of meetings. Now, another use of virtual offices, and one which has actually been much more relevant to my kind of business, has been that for various kind of historical, and I want to say antiquated reasons, I mean, the government has an interest in trying to keep straight what in the heck's going on in the business world. They want to know where all the addresses are and so on. And the public has rights to certain government records that includes where businesses are run from for consumer protection and other reasons. And so because of that, it used to be that if you wanted to run a business essentially from home or over the internet, you had to register your home address in a way that the public could just find if they looked, which, rightfully so, not everyone's super comfortable with. Virtual offices enable people to have essentially a forwarding address in a valid commercially zoned region. So it's another thing, right? I mean, in many cases, you might live someplace where it's explicitly against your leasing agreement, against your zone of the city for valid reasons. They don't want you running out of company out of there. They don't want employees stopping by there. They don't want customers stopping by there, right? It's one thing if you're doing it kind of silently on the internet, not disturbing neighbors or anything. It's a whole nother if someone's trying to run I don't know, some sort of business next door and there's all kinds of fuss and parking problems and things related to that. So that's another reason why they keep a lockdown on this stuff. But virtual offices enable for a much lower cost to have a valid business address, and then through the suite number or through some other kind of number that they put on it, they forward mail based on whose business is doing that. And then they kind of centralize one office that becomes, in addition to a valid business address for people, also makes it so that the public records can reflect the business's address without having to be the individual. Because if the IRS or local city government or a complaining customer needs to find that business, they can still get them via proxy by going through that intermediary's address. It's another way virtual addresses have kind of addressed those things. When doing physical events, and before I ran online conferences and so on, and I've long assisted with Indiecade and other kind of events, one of the things about physical events that a lot of us take for granted, but a business can't, is liability. And that's where if you have a physical location and there are people there, customers, clients, people interacting in general, you're liable for a lot of different things that might happen in that space. Between people, sometimes even just a person with themselves if they slip and they fall. And maybe the floor is dry, but the stairs design or the handrail or something not quite up to code how you wish it was or how it was meant to be or over time didn't get maintained or whatever it was, as a business you can be liable for those things. Whereas when you're running a fully online organization, granted there's still other concerns you gotta look out for, but a lot of those certain kind of physical liabilities are largely removed, which is kind of nice. One of the first businesses I interfaced with, the iPhone publisher that Topple was published through. When I visited their offices in downtown San Francisco, I was pretty impressed. And then the second time I visited them, they had just had their offices ransacked. Someone had broken in and stolen a bunch of their stuff, a bunch of their equipment, a bunch of their gear. This was like early iPhone time when iPhones were pretty valuable, and office got just robbed. And I'm sure they had some sort of insurance to recover from that stuff. They changed office locations to a different part of the city. But when you run an online business, again, there's other kinds of security you have to watch out for, but that physical robbery from the part of town you're in, not quite the same concern, which is nice. And between the lower overhead, being able to deliver services and products to customers at lower cost, between the ability to spare customers and clients a drive or parking challenges, between the convenience for running it, of not needing to commute, of, for that matter, when I'm traveling somewhere else, so when I'm out for GDC all week, I can still check in on my company and my businesses just the same as when I'm doing anything else, anywhere else back home. And all these things make it really, really beneficial in a way that it just is hard to justify. Real estate, especially in the big cities where it used to be very common to have a lot of major companies, is staggeringly expensive. Renting buildings is staggeringly expensive. Maintaining physical spaces is staggeringly expensive. And part of what happens is that in order to do those kind of operations, they've got to raise so much capital or take on so much debt or otherwise put themselves at the mercy of having to do business in a more conventional way, which makes it much more apples to apples competition of who can one-up each other just a little bit more in these massive kind of business warfare scenarios. But when costs can be kept down, when things can be run much leaner, because you don't have an enormous physical campus to constantly maintain, it actually frees you up considerably to experiment a bit more, to try different ways of doing things. And that's where the innovation can occur. That's where the niche targeting can occur. That's where a business can serve people who otherwise aren't finding themselves served by things that have to be at a certain scale of operation to justify that level of investment to run those kind of massive corporations. And all of this is also to say that it used to be that a mom and pop shop, which is a often meant as a disparaging term for a lifestyle business, also occasionally used as a disparaging term for a small company meant to stay small, that's not trying to be explosive in growth, can increasingly also be run entirely virtual, online, remote workers. And another benefit to this, speaking of which, is that a major advantage that big companies in large cities have often had is that that's often where the talent would go. That's often where the people who had the highest caliber skills, who could earn the highest pay and so on, whether they're engineers, artists, producers, some other kind of work entirely, writers, directors, and so on, would gravitate towards, because that's where the opportunities were for them. But increasingly, because of online remote work, in a lot of situations, it's possible to live somewhere else you'd rather be. Maybe it's because it's a less expensive place to live, and so you can stretch your money further there. Maybe it's because it's closer to where your family is. Maybe it's just an environment you personally prefer in terms of it's quieter than the big city might be. All these kind of advantages give people who have options the option to go elsewhere. And on the other side, an opportunity for businesses to leverage that kind of talent no matter where they are in the world, without having to be, oh, we need to be next to the train stations in San Francisco in order to have access to that talent. Now, no matter where you're running the business from, you can have access to that talent as long as you can work out circumstances and arrangements and situations such that they want to do the work that's asked of them for the amount they can be paid and the arrangement it can be structured in. For all these reasons, it increasingly seems like remote work will continue to take off, will continue to replace more businesses. And again, it seems like certain kinds will probably continue to be in person as they need to be. But one of the things that I didn't figure out until, I can't even remember when I kind of pieced this together, I'd see all these skyscrapers. And I used to wonder, what in the heck's happening inside that enormous building? Right? There's all those little offices. And I couldn't figure out. And of course, it's not just one company. It's tons of companies, tons of businesses, all filling up those spaces where each one kind of had its own little cubby, its own little space there, where it was buried in the skyscraper because most customers didn't have to go to it. It might be largely business to business. It might be mail order, might be some other kind of business that it was in. Increasingly, I think those businesses may not need a little cubby in a skyscraper anymore. And so I'm curious to see how that's going to shape our city spaces, the world ahead of us. This is, of course, something which I take great pride in Gamketo Club. Our members are getting practice in working remotely. And it is certainly very different pattern and rhythmically to not be constantly watched over. It's obviously closer to the freelancer lifestyle of self-regulating tasks, self-regulating work, self-regulating pace, learning to communicate in a way that touches base, in a way that keeps people comfortable, or finding that balance of being available but also establishing boundaries. Being able to deliver results remotely is, I think, going to be a key skill set going forward, and one which I'm pleased that as much as coding or art or level design or any other thing that our group does, and audio practice and so on for building games, I think it's also really valuable that our people in our group are getting remote work experience in a way they can show they got results doing purely remotely. So pretty proud of that. I think that's pretty cool. But, be curious to hear in comments below if you've had some experiences working remotely. What has it been like? I can say certainly, even though my first publisher deal back in 2008 was a local arrangement, my next one was in New York City via San Francisco. And what I realized was working with those people was really no different than the ones who were in downtown San Francisco. Maybe it resulted in one extra flight. Maybe it resulted in, I visit the office once every 2 months instead of twice a month. Even still, it felt the same, and it worked the same, and the rhythm was the same, because it was still mostly on the phone or the internet anyway, which, given long distance calls have disappeared, given the ease of video conferencing, Skype calls, and so on, it's all just changing in a way which I think is in a good direction that can hopefully give people more options for how and where they want to live, how they choose to work, how we're able to transform our opportunities by working remotely. But again, curious to hear in the comments your experience with working remotely. If you've had bad experiences with it, curious to hear about that too. What's your thoughts on, is it going to continue to keep on growing? Is it maybe already hit as much as we can do remotely as what we're seeing today? Thanks so much for tuning in.